There comes a moment when something inside you breaks, quietly, without warning. Not because of a specific event, not because of one person, but because you've been carrying something for too long that was never yours to hold. And on that day, without you even looking for it, everything starts to change. You've always felt things more deeply than most people. The emotions of those around you, their tension, what they leave unsaid. You could sense it before they even expressed it. You absorbed everything. You adapted to everything. And for a long time, you thought it was a flaw. That feeling this much meant you were fragile. That giving this much was simply who you were. So you kept going. You gave without limits, understood without being understood, supported without being supported. You excused behaviors that should have warned you. You minimized your own needs so you wouldn't disturb anyone. And every time someone took advantage of that generosity, you looked within yourself for what had made you so vulnerable. As if the problem was your sensitivity, as if feeling so much was the real cause of your wounds. Then something shifted. A quiet moment, almost invisible, when a new certainty began to form inside you. Not anger, not rebellion, something deeper, more stable, an understanding. That your sensitivity was never your weakness, that it had simply been misunderstood by others and most of all by you. That's when something in your vzglad changed, when familiar faces started to feel unfamiliar, when you couldn't quite find the words to explain what was changing inside you, but you felt, with a calm certainty, that you couldn't go back. Many saw that change as you becoming harder, colder, more distant, less accessible, but that's not what it was. It was something else. Carl Jung spent his life studying these inner turning points. He called them the beginning of individuation, that deep and often painful process where a person stops living according to the mask the world placed on them and begins to encounter who they really are. He never described this process as a simple release. He described it as a confrontation with everything you buried, erased, or sacrificed just to belong. What you're going through is not a crisis. It may be the first time you are truly getting close to who you are. The empath's life before the shift. For years, the empath lives in a constant state of giving. They give their attention, their energy, their time, often without anyone explicitly asking for it. It comes naturally, almost instinctively, because something in them senses other people's needs before they're even expressed. That ability feels like a strength, and yet it carries a hidden crack that few people recognize at first, and that the empath themselves often takes a very long time to see, because that crack makes no noise. It doesn't show up through conflict or visible breakdowns. It deepens quietly, on the inside. In that space, the empath never really learned to inhabit, the space of themselves. This ability to perceive others, to feel them, to understand them deeply, didn't develop in a vacuum. Carl Jung showed that the most powerful psychological traits in a person are always shaped in response to an environment. They don't appear out of nowhere. They emerge as adaptations. And in the case of the empath, this heightened sensitivity to other people's emotional states is often the trace of an early, unconscious learning, something almost physical. The learning that perceiving others, anticipating their needs, detecting their moods, was a form of safety, not a chosen safety. A constructed one, built slowly and quietly within an environment that required the child to be attentive before being themselves. We'll come back to this original mechanism, to what it reveals about the empath's early years and how they were shaped psychologically. Because before fully understanding it, we need to look at what it actually produces in adult life and why its effects are so hard to recognize from the inside. What it creates is a life turned outward. The empath learns to tune into others the way you tune into a frequency. They adjust their behavior, their tone, their presence based on what they perceive around them. They become exceptionally skilled at easing tension, filling silence, making others feel comfortable. They can read a room before saying a single word. They sense the fatigue in a voice, the anger behind a smile, the fragility beneath a composed exterior. And they adapt, always, automatically, because it's something they've been doing for so long it no longer feels like a choice. It's become a second nature, a way of being in the world so deeply integrated that it goes unquestioned. They don't stop to ask whether this constant adjustment costs them something. They don't wonder what they would feel if they stopped adapting all the time, because the very idea of not adjusting to others feels almost unthinkable. But in that process, something is slowly lost. Their own inner frequency, their own needs, their own voice, and that loss is so quiet, so gradual, that they don't notice it. They simply believe they are someone generous, understanding, patient. They don't yet see that they've faded themselves out. They don't yet see that this generosity, as sincere as it is partly built on an inability to exist without factoring in other people's gaze. And that self-erasure, contrary to what it might seem, never comes without consequences. Its effects on the empath's psyche are exactly what Carl Jung spent his life trying to understand. And what he uncovered sheds a striking light on why some people always end up drained in their relationships, even when their intentions are the best they can be. What the empath doesn't know yet. There's something most empaths don't understand for a very long time, something that hides behind every disappointment, every betrayal, every relationship that left them empty, even though they gave everything. It's not that they chose the wrong people. It's not that they're too naive or too idealistic. It's that the way they relate to others carries a very specific vulnerability, one that doesn't come from their sensitivity, but from what they've learned to do with it. When an empath grows up learning that reading others is a form of safety, they unknowingly develop a tendency to put their own needs on hold to maintain peace, connection, a sense of belonging. They become experts at detecting what others expect from them, and they respond to it, not out of calculation, out of reflex, out of a habit so deep it has merged with their personality. The problem is that some people don't see this availability as a quality, but as a resource, not always consciously, but they gravitate toward the empath precisely because the empath doesn't ask for anything, doesn't disrupt, doesn't confront. And the empath, on their side, often interprets that closeness as connection, when it's sometimes nothing more than one-sided comfort. It's often through a betrayal, an abandonment, or a deep disappointment that something begins to shift. Not immediately, not cleanly. But the experience creates a crack in the belief that giving endlessly will always be recognized. And for the first time, the empath begins to ask a question they've always avoided. Not, what did I do wrong? But why did I accept putting myself aside for so long? That question changes everything, because it moves the responsibility. It doesn't throw it onto the other person, but it no longer turns it against their own sensitivity either. It points to something deeper, older, more structural. Carl Jung observed that the human psyche is built around a central character he called the persona, that social mask each person develops to function in the world and be accepted by others. For the empath, this persona is particularly strong, particularly well constructed. It's made of kindness, attentiveness, availability, quiet self-sacrifice. It's made of all those qualities people admire on the surface, but that can become, when they're not balanced by a solid sense of self, an invisible prison. And for a long time, the empath believes this persona is who they are. They don't see the distance between that mask and their true self. Carl Jung called this confusion identification with the persona, and he saw it as one of the deepest obstacles to a person's psychological development. What this identification creates in the empath's daily life, and how it inevitably begins to crack, is where the core of this inner transformation lies, the one so many people go through without ever being able to name it. The moment everything shifts. Before this change can be named, it's felt. Long before the empath finds the words to describe what's happening inside, their body and mind start sending signals. A fatigue that doesn't go away with rest, a new irritability in situations that never used to affect them, a growing need for solitude, not out of sadness, but out of a need to reconnect with something they can't quite identify. That something is themselves, not the version others know, not the role they've played for years, them. And this inner search, subtle as it may be at first, marks the beginning of what Carl Jung considered the most important process in a human life. Carl Jung described this moment as the beginning of an encounter with what he called the shadow, that part of the self that has been repressed, ignored, or judged unacceptable. For the empath, the shadow doesn't look like an inner monster. It feels like a voice they learned to silence very early on, a voice that says no, a voice that expresses anger, a voice that sets demands, draws boundaries, refuses to bend. The empath has often been taught to see that voice as dangerous, selfish, incompatible with who they believe they are, so they buried it, covered it with generosity, patience, understanding. But that voice never disappeared. It waited, and when it starts to rise, often after a deep wound or total exhaustion, the empath doesn't always know what to do with it. They may mistake it for bitterness, for becoming hardened, for losing themselves, when in reality, it's the opposite. What Carl Jung uncovered about the nature of this shadow and what it reveals about the empath's deeper psychological structure is one of the most important keys to understanding why this turning point, as painful as it is actually the beginning of a reconstruction. This shift starts to show up clearly in relationships. The empath begins to see dynamics they never noticed before. They recognize patterns. They identify the people who are taking without truly giving. They notice the conversations that always drained them, the connections that only existed because they agreed to disappear. And as you're about to see, this new clarity changes something irreversible, something that can't be undone, even if part of them wishes it could, because once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. What this shift changes at a deep level. From the outside, this change is often seen as a kind of hardening. People who knew the empath before notice they're less available, less pliable, less easy to pull in emotionally. Some accuse them of changing. Others drift away without explanation, as if this new way of being makes them uncomfortable, without them really knowing why. And the empath, in moments of doubt, sometimes wonders if they're losing something essential, if this new distance is a kind of inner loss, if becoming more selective, more protective of their energy, means becoming less human. But what Carl Jung showed is that this transformation isn't a shutdown, it's an integration. The empath doesn't lose their sensitivity. They simply stop letting it run their relationships without filter, without discernment, without awareness of the cost. They begin to develop something they were never really allowed to claim before, a form of emotional discernment, the ability to choose where their energy goes and how much of it they give. The ability to stay fully present in some relationships and to step back from others, not out of indifference, but out of respect for themselves. They no longer try to be liked by everyone. They no longer try to ease every tension or fill every silence. And this new restraint, instead of diminishing their relationships, makes them more real, more balanced, more mutual. What this transformation reveals about the true nature of empathic sensitivity, what it really is and what it never was, challenges almost everything the empath has believed about themselves for years. And once that truth is seen, it doesn't leave the empath where it found them. It pushes them to look back with completely different eyes, not to suffer from what they see, but to finally understand why everything unfolded exactly the way it did. Looking back with a different eye doesn't mean replaying every scene. It means starting to see the underlying patterns that were present in every relationship, every moment when the empath chose silence instead of speaking their truth. This new awareness doesn't feel like a sudden revelation. It feels like a slow adjustment in vision, as if someone slightly shifted the light in a room you thought you knew perfectly, and you begin to notice details that were always there, just unseen. What the empath starts to perceive isn't a truth about others. It's a truth about what they were carrying, the roles they took on without choosing them, the silences they filled, the tension they absorbed, the emotional spaces they occupied out of habit, out of fear of emptiness. And this realization is one of the most unsettling a person can go through, because it doesn't point outward, it points inward. There comes a moment when the question changes. It's no longer, "What am I missing?" It becomes quieter, steadier. It asks what is actually there, what they can now perceive that they couldn't before, what they are still carrying, and what they have slowly, almost without noticing, set down. This inner space the empath begins to inhabit isn't comfortable, it isn't reassuring, it's simply honest. And for someone who has spent years bending, fading into the background so others could feel at ease, that inner honesty may be the strangest and most valuable thing they can experience. Carl Jung wrote that the journey toward oneself is the longest journey a human being can take, not because it leads far away, but because it leads to where you've always been, without ever truly stopping there. Now I'd like you to reflect on these two questions. Is there a version of you from a few years ago that you no longer recognize today? What has changed? Share your experience in the comments. I always read you carefully,